Hello, welcome back to Busch History. My name is David Busch, and I'm doing a series of presentations on American history on YouTube here. And this is topic 15.2. 15.1 was a PowerPoint with the same exact slide I have behind me. And 15.2 is going to be an analysis and a look at a set of notes dealing with the post-Civil War industrialization of the United States. It's important to understand that once we settle the issue of federal power in the Civil War, that business in the United States starts looking at expanding, and huge amounts of wealth are going to be generated as we develop mining in the United States, as we develop the railroads, as we develop banking, and we develop shipbuilding, and ultimately international trade in the United States. I'm going to take a look at what happens during the latter part of the 19th century right now. And it all revolves around what I like to call the three kings of the period. We have John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan. So I want to take a look at this set of slides with you and a series of events and see if we can figure out how a lot of this occurs. This is a note set I call Drawing Conclusions. I'd like to just look through this with you. It says, analyze the collection of information below. See how many conclusions or inferences you can draw about the time period. Here you go. 1876. My God, it talks. Bell invents telephone. In 1876, Edison opens his Menlo Park laboratory. In 1879, Edison invents the vacuum tube. It burns for over 13 hours. That vacuum tube, by the way, is the predecessor of the light bulb. 1892, Edison lights up New York City. 1865 to 1892, American inventors had filed over 1 million patents. 1900, over 4,000 automobiles are produced. 1903, the Wright brothers took their first flight. In 1865, the gross national product of the United States was $2 billion. In 1900, the gross national product of the United States was $13 billion. The gross national product, which we now use the term gross domestic product, the gross national product is the sum of everything produced in the United States. Gross, everything, national, the nation, product, what we produce. It's the sum of everything produced in the United States. You can see the tremendous increase in the time and what we're producing. In 1898, most of the factories have replaced steam with electricity. In 1868, 30 years prior to that, Cincinnati meat packers set up the first production line. It was actually, I also call it a destruction line because of the way that the carcasses were treated. The live animal came into the slaughterhouse, and by the time it left, it was hamburger patties. In 1881, the cigarette making machine was patented. It produced 7,000 cigarettes per hour. 7,000 an hour. The previous production was 3,000 per day. 1884, 15 machines produced enough cigarettes to satisfy all of U.S. consumption and began exporting to Europe. Isn't it interesting that something today that we look at as such a horrible habit was so pivotal in the development of industry in the United States? In 1888, diamond matches emulate cigarette production and dominate the world market. Those are wooden matches with little red tips. 1870, Standard Oil is established. John D. Rockefeller, move this up a little bit. John D. Rockefeller controlled 90% of the oil production by 1880. In 1882, Standard Oil Trust was established. That was the monopoly tendency of Standard Oil. This is a quote. God gave me money. That's what John D. Rockefeller said. Let us remember there is not a poor person in the United States who is not made poor by his own shortcomings. Baptist minister Russell Conwell, acres of diamonds. So there was a mindset that the poor deserved to be poor. In 1901, Carnegie sells Carnegie Steel to J.P. Morgan for $480 million, helping to create U.S. Steel. And the funny thing was, he lent J.P. Morgan money to buy it. The largest steel business in the world, Carnegie was said to be the richest man in the world. He loaned Morgan the money for the transaction. In 1860, U.S. immigration was 200,000. In 1882, it was 800,000. Between 1860 and 1890, 10 million immigrants arrived in the United States from Northern Europe and Asia. 1910, 53% of all wage workers are foreign-born. In 1860, 16 cities had more than 500,000 residents. In 1860, 16 cities had more than 50,000 residents. In 1890, 1/3 of Americans lived in the cities. Chicago and Philadelphia had more than 1 million people. New York City had more than 3 million people. And in 1899, 90% of manufacturing occurred in cities. So if we were to look for one big conclusion, there's a lot of small conclusions you can make, there's no doubt about it. But if we were to look for one big conclusion, we would say there's an awful lot happening in terms of business development in the United States in this time period. So I'd like to take a look at a note set that brings this stuff together. Just let me bring this around here the way I want it. And let's take a look. This says Chapter 19 notes, and Chapter 19, I'm referring to Farragher's out of many. Remember, you can use any textbook you like for this. Most textbooks follow a similar chronological timeline through American history. Anyway, Chapter 19 notes complete the following set of notes. I've completed them for you. Dealing with industrialization and immigration. Identify or explain the gospel of wealth. This was Andrew Carnegie's idea. Andrew Carnegie's belief that the rich have a responsibility to take care of the poor because he believes in this class-like society. That the poor are poor and they're going to stay that way, and the rich should be benevolent towards them. Captains of industry. They were called captains of industry by their friends, and they were called robber barons by their enemies. These are the guys who ran industry in the United States. Gilded Age, a very interesting term coined by Mark Twain. This term, basically, what it did was it described life in the United States. Gilding is taking a poor quality metal and covering it with a thin layer of gold so it looks better. So he said we had a gilded society. That society really was struggling, but we only looked at its successes and ignored the failures and the poverty within. Standard Oil, the first large-scale monopoly that was begun by John D. Rockefeller. Now we have explain the effect of the Cincinnati meat production line. This was probably horrific by modern standards. The cow would come in, would be ushered into the slaughterhouse, and it would quickly be killed. And then within a matter of moments, it would end up as steak and chops. A destruction line instead of a production line in which live animals were brought to a slaughter and systematically processed into consumable meat for the public, greatly increasing the output of meat products. So it enters walking, it leaves in cans. Then you have the cigarette making machine, 1881. Mass production technique applied to cigarette making. Remember 7,000 cigarettes an hour? Machines doing the work previously performed by hand greatly increased the daily output of cigarettes. Mass retailing. No, this is not stores going to church. This is the beginning of large-scale shopping centers. And it starts with department stores. Montgomery Ward and Sears Roebuck and Company were two of the early ones. And they attempted to put everything you wanted under one roof. Kind of like the predecessor of the mall. And of course, Sears still exists today. And what they also did is they had a mail order division that would mail catalogs all across the United States. It's kind of cool. Ask your parents if they have any of the Sears catalogs. They used to come once a year. The process ended in the 1990s, and the catalogs are pretty thick. And you could order anything you wanted in these catalogs. In the early Sears catalogs, you could order houses and cars. Vertical integration, horizontal integration, that was discussed in the PowerPoint, but vertical integration is a business model in which you control the entire process, from the raw material to the finished good. You control it, it's under your name. Apple is a good modern example of this, where Apple controls the entire thing. If you control the entire process, you can keep your costs low. If you can keep your costs low, it makes you very competitive because you can also keep your price lower than the competition. Horizontal combinations. This is what the game Monopoly is all about. Horizontal combinations are you seek to control the market. You want to be the only steel manufacturer. You want to be the only oil producer. You want to be the only auto manufacturer. Imagine if you could be the only milk producer in a state, how much money you would make. Yeah, a lot. That's horizontal integration. That's a monopoly. That is illegal now. It wasn't illegal in the beginning. It was actually a pretty cool idea. The Sherman Antitrust Act was the first law put in place to try to deal with all of this. And it said, it was passed in 1890, and it said combinations operating restraints of trade are illegal. Unfortunately, the government, back in business in the day, used this law against unions, not against monopolies. We started to have production quotas. Competition and piecework increased because workers were paid by what they produced, by the amount of things they produced. So they became slaves to the machines because the more they produced, the more money they would make. The wage system. Under a wage system, people are paid by the hour. So the more hours you work, the more money you get paid. The wage system, workers lost the ability to work for themselves and now work for some form of manufacturing in which they were paid by a specific unit of time or piece. That was what spawned the 8-hour day movement, because manufacturers were trying to get their workers to work more and more hours, and of course the workers would often do it because they'd get paid more. So they pay them less per hour and make them work more hours. The Haymarket Riot grew out of this wage system and a desire for an 8-hour day, because that's what they were protesting for. As cities industrialized, their population grew incredibly. And we're going to start to have small neighborhoods with different kinds of people. They're going to be called ghettos. Ghettos are simply ethnic neighborhoods, but they're going to come as a result of this industrialization. Now we have a group of people, and it begins with, why are these people important? Well, because they're figures. They're figures in a time period. And some of them are pretty interesting. This guy, Jay Gould. Jay Gould was known as the worst man in the world because he was so unscrupulous in his investment practices. He was an entrepreneur, and he used money to make money. And some of those people aren't that nice. So here's an example. He would often feed cows large amounts of salt before the cows would go to auction. Now, of course, the cows would turn around and they would drink a lot of water. Thereby, the cows weighed more, and when they weighed them at auction, they would sell them for more because they were sold by the pound. That was Jay Gould. Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie, he's the rags to riches story. He's a Scottish immigrant who got his job at the Pennsylvania Railroad and worked his way up by being industrious and by being a hard worker. He was often the first person at his job in the morning and the last person to leave. And he simply started out as a courier, bringing messages, and then he would write messages, and then he would make sure things, supplies were procured correctly. And he really worked his way up to Carnegie Steel. John D. Rockefeller. Well, you can't say too much about this guy. He founded Standard Oil, and the whole idea of monopolies and trusts is credited to John D. Rockefeller. He, with Andrew Carnegie, probably the two most important men of the era. William Silvis, he founded the National Labor Union, which is a forerunner of some of the other unions of the day. And Sam Gompers founded the American Federation of Labor, which still exists today. Remember, only skilled workers, did not want immigrants, did not want minorities, did not want women. Ugly, but efficient. Thorstein Veblen, one of my favorite characters because he describes something that is very, very true. He coins an expression called conspicuous consumption. The idea that the wealthy wanted to show their wealth. So they would wear jewelry, they would have fancy cars, they would have fancy clothing. The whole Pullman car company was like that. And they would build houses with large front porches and big windows in the front so people could walk by and see the beautiful chandelier hanging from the ceiling because they wanted to show off their wealth. Today we would call it bling, conspicuous consumption. Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington is a very interesting man. He's a former slave, and he believed that the black man needed to integrate into the white world by learning trades that the white world wanted. So he was an advocate of practical education. He stressed the need for practical instruction in lieu of more intellectual knowledge. And he started the Tuskegee Institute, so he was working more for accommodation of the white people by the black people as opposed to assimilation. It would be very controversial in time. Explain the effect of big business on self-employment. Well, it basically trashed self-employment because you couldn't compete as an artisan. It reduced self-employment and made a nation of wage earners. By 1990, 2/3 of all workers were wage earners. Explain the effect of big business on immigration. Well, it allowed for a lot of immigrants to come to the United States very quickly to get jobs. And notice I have a typo, I'll have to change that one. Big business on skilled workers and craftsmen. It took away their authority and relegated them to being wage earners, pretty much. African Americans and immigrant women. It created jobs for both in manual labor, although they still were low on the pecking order. Big business allowed English-speaking white women clerical positions, typewriters, telephone operators, and the like. African Americans and Chinese men, the railroads. The big business jobs for these two groups specifically were on the railroads prior to about 1890. Unskilled workers. How did big business affect unskilled workers? Well, they hired them as operatives in factories, operating machines, fixing machines, repetitive, tiresome, boring tasks that if they were hurt on the job, they would simply be dismissed and replaced. Education. Well, business required educated workers, so it actually starts to spawn education, but education for business. Prior to education for business, it was education for the self. You became a better person because you're an educated person. Now, you're going to get educated so you can get a job. For most of recorded history, education was a way to benefit the individual and thereby society. Now, and in the world we live in today, education is to get a job. It's kind of a sad way of looking at the purpose of education. Why was the American Federation of Labor successful in comparison to the Knights of Labor? Just as it says, the AFL in 1886, because it sought only skilled workers from craft unions across the country. They were highly selective, and when you're highly selective, it makes bargaining easier, because you're bargaining for people who are valued as opposed to people who are largely expendable. Why did ethnic neighborhoods evolve? Basically, comfort. People want to be with people with similar characteristics and backgrounds. So we'll get Chinatown, we'll get Little Italy, we'll get Little Germany, we'll get these areas that are dominated by one ethnicity over another, and that still exists today. It's not as ironclad, there isn't a wall that separates these neighbors, but you still have Irish neighbors. I come from a town where it seems like, 1 out of every 3 people is Irish, and another 1 out of every 3 people is Italian, and I don't get what the third part is, but dominated my town, my hometown is dominated by Irish and Italian. By this point in time, you can see that the United States has become an economic powerhouse. We are dominating the oil industry, we are mining, we are having a huge influx of immigrants into the United States. Our output is incredible, our productive capacity is incredible, the government is behind industry. We're going places. We are entering the 20th century as the economic colossus of the world. And you can see with this excess capacity, we're going to need overseas markets. And that's what's going to happen starting in the 1890s with the acquisition of Hawaii, the Spanish-American War, and the former Spanish colonies, including the Philippines, and control of Cuba. So we can get additional markets. I hope you found this useful. This is something I really enjoy doing, and I hope it's working for anyone that's watching. For now, I'm David Busch, and I'll see you next time. The next topic will be populism, leading into American expansion. So have a good day, take care, and thanks for watching.